Neil from Messick's here to cut open a bunch of additional filters for you. I always enjoy these videos. I think it's interesting to see the guts of some of these things. This particular example here actually has an interesting story behind it. This was a gentleman who went out to Amazon to pick up some filters for his tractor, and when he went to put them on the machine, he was a little surprised at some of the things that he found and the shortcomings of some of these products before he even put oil into them. So I very kindly bought that filter kit from him, sent him the proper stuff for his machine, and we're going to use that as an example here today to find some of the things that you might stumble upon when going outside of the intended filters for your machine.
Messick's, a helping hand with your land.
So this is advertised as a filter kit for a Kubota B3200. And in a filter kit, you're gonna have several different kinds of filters. So up here we have 2 air filters, 2 fuel filters, some engine oil filters, some hydraulic filters, and hydrostatic filters. This one does the transmission and this other one does all the hydraulic fluid pumping through your tractor. We're gonna go through these one at a time here and look at some of the differences between them, and we're gonna start with the ones that are the least sketchy. So starting here for the least sketchy are the fuel filters, and you're gonna see, looking at these 2 tiny little fuel filters, that their plastic bases are about the same, and you have nearly equal amounts of pleating and stuff that's here. Now, we don't have enough specifications on either of these to be able to go through and look at things like the micron rating and stuff on these small filters. But when we're dealing with tractors like this that are in lower horsepower classes, and specifically ones that don't have common rail and high pressure fuel injectors on them, you're usually pretty safe if you go off-brand a little bit for these basic fuel filters. I will throw out a caution that changes immediately when you get into those high-pressure fuel systems. We see a lot of problems there caused by people running the wrong filters. That is not the case, though, with these simple little ones. These are more here just to collect trash, algae, dirt, that kind of stuff, and aren't doing real fine filtering of the fuel as is required on higher horsepower machines. Next up in the not so sketchy side of things is the air filters, and generally air filter assemblies are not usually built by the tractor company themselves, right? They're sourced from another supplier, usually somebody like Donaldson, who's gonna build those assemblies and stuff that sit on top of the engine. So no one is out there casting specific plastics and that kind of stuff. And for that reason, the aftermarket side and the availability of multiple lines of air filters is actually pretty good. Even here within our own store, we're able to cross between a lot of the different brands that we carry and source what looks like very much the same filter from a lot of different places, but in many cases they're fairly interchangeable. That does appear to be the case here. While these are certainly not probably out of the same factory, when you look at things like their construction, the amount of pleating that's in the air filter, the sealing faces that are up here on the top, I wouldn't expect to have any fit issues putting this into my machine. Next up is the hydraulic suction filter. This is the filter that sits in the bottom of the transmission and pulls that fluid out and pumps it up through the rest of the tractor systems. This is where things start to get more complicated, right? A lot less standardization out there in the industry of what's expected from your machine and from your filter. And so these are where they tend to get a little bit more expensive, but we also start to see construction issues. When we look here at the faces of the filters themselves, they look very similar. Threading's the same. Wouldn't see a whole lot of issue with screwing this onto your machine, but the one thing that we definitely do notice here is that the rubber on the OEM filter is much softer than the rubber that's on the aftermarket. It's pretty common when you look at the reviews for these things to see complaints from people that can't get them to seal up properly. It's probably because that facing O-ring is just a much harder metal. They also weren't wrapped in plastic in their packaging. These OEM filters often come through wrapped up to keep these components here from drying out. That was not the case with these. When we go here a step further and we pull out the elements themselves, you're gonna notice there actually might be a little bit more pleating here on the aftermarket than what there is on the OEM, but the flow characteristics of these appear to be different. The holes on the inside of the OEM filter are much larger than the ones on the aftermarket. So if you're gonna measure the amount of GPM that can go through these filters, the OEM one is going to flow more fluid through it than what the aftermarket does. When we drop these down in the bottom, both these cans have springs in the bottom of them. Those springs are there that if these things plug up and the oil needs to find its way past the filter, so it doesn't starve the transmission for oil, those springs will compress. And when we compress the OEM filter versus compressing the aftermarket filter, it takes significantly more pressure to push that aftermarket filter down than what it does the OEM. So if they plug, this aftermarket one is going to be more apt to starve your machine for hydraulic fluid than what the intended filter is. Next up is the hydrostatic filter. And you're going to see some of the same issues here on the faces of these filters. In this case, this O-ring here is really proud compared to what the OEM filter is. And I'm going to see much the same stuff. The rubber on this one being a lot harder. Again, probably the source of some of the leaking issues that you tend to hear about. Threads and everything look okay, probably screws on just fine. We keep working our way into here. We pull the drain back valves off and look at the filter elements themselves. You're going to notice that despite the cans themselves being a very similar size, the filters themselves are not. The OEM filter here being much larger, and again, internally, having much larger openings on the inside for higher flow. And so, again, a difference in the way that these things are going to flow, right, on your machine. Now, here's something that's interesting. We go and we look at the pressure relief in here. Here's a case where the OEM filter does not have a pressure relief. This one is not made to bypass and allow that dirty oil past it, where this one will. Okay? Not sure exactly what the engineers have in mind here, but there is a reason that these things are constructed this way, right? There must be a decision made that no oil is better than dirty oil, right? And in this application, if you've got this thing plugging up, your tractor, you're gonna feel that when you drive versus the other hydraulic filter that we were looking at. When that's pumping, if something's wrong with it, you're not gonna notice that, right? This one you will. So that could be the reason for that decision, but there is a construction difference here. The Kubota one does not have a bypass, the aftermarket does. Next up is the engine oil filter, and this is where things started getting fun. So we're gonna work our way through the same stuff here. When we look at the face of these things, you're gonna notice the same stuff that we talked about with the O-rings at this point. This same O-ring is used on many of these filters here, but this one here has a totally different profile and frankly is softer than the hydraulic filters that we were looking at earlier. Both of these have anti-drain back valves on the inside of them. That's to keep the trash from coming from the filter back into the engine. That's going to be very similar. And when we look at the filters themselves, you're going to see that they're very similar. The pleating here on the OEM is denser than the pleating on the aftermarket. And the internal construction of them looks very much the same, so they're probably going to flow very similarly. And when we look at bypass, in this case, this one is a little softer to my feel than what the OEM one is. So there's a pressure difference there. But this actually wasn't the thing that was the most concerning to our customer here that was looking at these things, because he noticed that this is the wrong part number right here for his tractor. When they put this kit together, the company that did it used a cheaper filter that still screws onto the engine, but isn't actually the one that's intended for the machine. This is the one that's intended for the machine. So Kubota actually specs a larger engine oil filter for this engine, and when you look at these parts, you're gonna see they're actually thread interchangeable. You could screw this smaller one on and it would fit up just fine, but it's gonna have less filtering capacity than the filter that was intended for that tractor. So when we take the right one here and pull the filter out of the can, we're gonna see a much larger filter with more capacity, more holes in the inside, allowing it to flow, and just different construction, right? So the concern here is, could be a couple of things. It could be that you starve your engine for oil a little bit because you don't have the same flow characteristics through this larger filter. Or when you're considering your service intervals, you're not gonna be able to operate your machine up to that intended interval because you've screwed on the wrong filter onto the tractor. So just because the threads match up and everything screws on okay does not mean it's right. And finally, the pricing front. A lot of times when people start to look to non-OEM options, it's because they have an immediate impression that they're going to save money. And as we've shown in other videos, sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not actually. We've seen a lot of cases where some of these aftermarket filter kits can actually be significantly more expensive than what the OEM one is. But this is a case where it is actually less money. You can go up and pick up the Raptor filter kit off of Amazon for $69 at the moment. And if I went through and pieced these together coming out of our system, it's right about $100 worth of filters. So you're gonna save about $30 or so by going the aftermarket route. One thing I think is a little bit more interesting is we break down exactly which one of these filters is the reason why that starts to happen. And when you look at things like fuel filters and engine oil filters and air filters, you're gonna find that all of these things are very, very price competitive. These companies want your business, right? They want you coming back to them in order to buy the stuff for your tractor and in order to have that ongoing relationship, right? It's the same reason we want to sell you this stuff too, right? Because we want your business for everything else too. And so this stuff tends to be priced really, really well. So in most cases, you might save $1 or $2 by going off brand when you're looking at these like major engine filters. When you get over the transmission though, and you start looking at the hydraulic filters, that's where things start to change a little bit. Instead of being $10 and $12 and $13 for a filter, you start to get up to like some $25 and $30 filters. Part of that's going to be because of sales volume. There's not as many of these sold compared to engines, right? Think of all the Kubota engines that are in reefer trucks and power plants that are all over the place. There's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these filters sold versus some of these that get pretty specialized and pretty application specific as to what's going into an engine or a transmission and hydraulic system, right? Construction-wise, you can see they're not all that different from one another, but they are definitely made for a purpose when you see things like specific pressure reliefs and that kind of stuff in there. So that's the reason. That's where the price differential here happened. It's in the hydraulic filters and not in the mainline engine-related stuff. If you've watched our videos for a while, you've known this is probably the 10th filter kit that I've cut apart now at some point. I've been doing it for a number of years now. And I've started saving these filters. Unfortunately, I threw a lot of them away over the years, but the last one that we did here just a couple of months ago, again with a no-name filter kit off of Amazon, I expected to be able to set these things side by side and find that they were somehow the same. You know, they come from the same supplier, same factory, whatever. They don't. They're completely different in all cases for both of those knockoffs compared to the Kubota filter. You're gonna find subtle differences between every one of them. In no case here have these things been carbon copies of each other. So in summary, when I'm looking at a tractor and figuring these filters are gonna be on there for hundreds of hours before they're changed again, do I feel that it's worth $30 to be putting on things that are not engineered correctly for my machine? Absolutely not, right? I trust Kubota when it comes to servicing my equipment much more than I trust a tiny little aggressive dinosaur. So when we're shopping for this kind of stuff, that's the angle that I tend to come from it, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we do see mechanical issues caused by running filters that are not intended for your machine. It's just best to know what you're getting. So if you're shopping for this kind of stuff and we can help, it's all set up on our Messix.com website. You can punch in your model number there and it will bring up all the filters and service items that you need for your machine. We're here and ready to get everything out the door to you the same day that you plug that order into our website. Also have a great group of people here to help you on the phone. You know, we're a customer service oriented company and we're not going to put computers above people. So if you need help with your machine, you're working through something difficult, do give us a call. We're available at 800-222-3373 or online at Messix.com.